I'm going to start by introducing our next speaker, who I came across specifically because of her title, because I found it quite interesting. So taking activism into the corporate space, Sereena is an independent equity, inclusion, and diversity consultant, and she was formerly the worldwide head of culture and inclusion at MNC Saatchi Group. She's committed to creating organizational transformation, and she's worked with several companies, including Sony Music and Facebook. She's spoken on CNCB, BBC Radio, at The Guardian, and at Google, just to name a few. And she's also written for Campaign Live, Communication Arts, and The Drum. She's been featured in The Observer and Stylist magazine, and she contributed to a few titles, including Biracial Britain by Remo Adekoya. She currently sits on the advisory board for Hidden Hudson Beck Group and OK Mentor. And I'm also happy to share that she's joining us from a beautiful location, which I'm so, so jealous of, in sunny Greece. But we're so glad to have her joining us virtually. So, Sereena, so glad to have you here with us.
Hi, Valentina, thank you for such a lovely introduction. And you definitely should not be jealous, because we had thunderstorms last night and there are storms brewing again. So yeah, the sun is well and truly gone, but it's still bright, but just very blustery. Pleasure to be with you all. Hello.
So the nature of this session is a conversation with Sereena, just to speak a little bit about diversity and inclusion, but specifically the authenticity around it. So last year when we spoke about this topic, we were asking questions about the why. So why is diversity in content important? And from the moral standpoint, we know why, but also over the last year, a bunch of different research reports have been released, including one specifically by McKinsey, where they looked at the case that almost $10 billion worth of money was being lost by a lack of Black representation in Hollywood. So with business cases and evidence cases like that, just going to show that there is value in the diversity of content, it means that we know there's a why, so it's now time for us to take action. But linking back to what Genevieve mentioned earlier, there's this point around authenticity. So how do you make that content authentic so that it resonates with the audiences that content is shared with? And so my first question really to you, Sereena, and also in this conversation is, how can media companies create authentic representation in front of and behind the screen?
Yeah, so yeah, it's a great question. By the way, can you hear me okay?
You're good?
Perfect. You know, I think firstly, we need to make sure that we don't see any group as a monolith. I think far too often we see all white people the same, or all Black people the same, or all Asian people the same. And obviously then there's a whole other conversation for those who are, say, of mixed heritage as well. And I think the best way for us to have that authentic representation is to understand the nuances that sit within each different group. So, Valentina, when we spoke, I said that I was recently in Scotland doing the NC 500, and I was just absolutely surprised, in the most beautiful sense, to kind of go to the Orkney Islands, which until the 15th century, they were owned by Norway. So there is so much diversity within each group. And I think that is definitely one of the first steps that needs to be made, that not every single Black person is the voice for all Black people. And actually those experiences intersected with gender, class, sexuality can completely change one's experience. It can change the way people move through the world and change the way the world sees them. So I would probably say that's one of the first things that we need to do. And I think then secondly, you can't have authentic representation, in my view, also until you allow different groups to be in positions of power. So, it's all, very well allowing people to have a platform, but I think power is also really important. And I think that is what, the report that you shared with me, the McKinsey report on Black Hollywood, really demonstrated that, when you have Black executives in power, they bring in more Black people into a production. So power is really central to the conversations around authenticity as well.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think just one of the stories and points we've already mentioned before, just offline in the conversation, is when you have somebody of color or from one of the key diverse groups, it's easy for them to connect or invite other people who they know from that same group into that role, or mention the opportunity. And something that we heard this morning when hearing from Channel 4 is that through their connections of maybe working with a director, they were able to connect them with a producer and do a wider call out to get some more of that talent in. But what would you say are some good practical ways to even start that process? So where do you find the talent? Where do you find these people? And are you aware of any examples of media companies seeking out or putting in processes in place to try and make this thing happen?
Yeah, sure. So, all of this stuff, this work, equity, inclusion, and diversity, it starts with ourselves. It starts with us being very self-reflective. Who do we know? Who's in our bubble? Is our bubble inclusive or is it exclusive? And more often than not, people want to be around people that they feel comfortable with. And typically that comfort is found in a shared culture, typically. But, obviously we need to go much deeper. It has to go beyond culture, and it actually has to be values that binds us rather than culture. But I would say it starts with, and this is what I feel like I did really successfully at MC Saatchi. It's about broadening all of executives, all the senior leadership social network, introducing them to different people. And you can do that in so many different ways. You can do that with reverse mentoring schemes, or literally just making a real concerted effort to go to networking events that you wouldn't typically go to. Essentially, this is about you doing things differently and you being pushed out of your comfort zone. And just to kind of give you some examples of companies that are doing this really well. So I sit on an advisory board, as you've already mentioned, for Hudson Bet Group. And what I just love about the proposition, they might not be, they're not a media agency as such. They're actually a wonderful combination of many things. They've got a wonderful editorial strand to what they do. But what I love what they've done is they've made a real effort to seek out historically excluded talent. And I think also that's something we need to be mindful of with our language. Sometimes we use words like underrepresented, and yes, many groups are underrepresented, but I think sometimes we need to be even more specific. And actually, are we talking about people who have historically been excluded from industries, whether it be because of their class? We know that there are many industries that you have to do free internships, for instance. So that is, that's an active exclusion. I'm slightly going off on a tangent there, but yeah, I would say they are a fantastic representation, Hudson Bet Group. And if you don't know who they are, you should definitely look up them, because they do these wonderful interview spotlights on all different type of talent, from producers to writers to designers, and then that talent, then has this spotlight placed on them, and then other people are able to just acknowledge the wonderful work that they do and kind of make that relationship.
Great. So just to touch on something that you mentioned in connecting into those networks and building those new relationships, and you talked about being uncomfortable, which I think is a really common theme and challenge that a lot of us have, especially working in this space and wanting to really drive or champion diversity and inclusion. Often it involves discomfort, and often there's a lot of fear involved. We're afraid to say the wrong thing, to use the wrong term, to offend someone, or especially in the media space, to be blacklisted or cancelled, as cancel culture is a very prominent thing. So what can we do to kind of push past that fear and push past that discomfort and really try and create this authentic representation both on and off screen? So just how would you encourage, let's say, people in the room to push past the discomfort?
So I would say it has to start and come from both places. If we were just to view it just for a moment via a racialized lens, and we say we were just to say black and white, it's for Black communities to also acknowledge that white communities are sometimes going to say the wrong thing, and it's about also us affording each other a space to make mistakes. Although once those mistakes are made, there needs to be a commitment to make sure that we don't make them again. And yeah, I'm really anti-cancel culture because we need more bridges. We need more bridge people. We need people that are willing to kind of step into people's worlds and understand why they think the way that they think. There's a really beautiful quote by, I made a few notes. There's a really beautiful quote by the African-American writer, James Baldwin, which says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." I'll repeat that again. So not everything that is faced can be changed, because that's true, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And we need to truly know what people think as a starting point for really moving the dial. And yeah, that's kind of my view. Which is uncomfortable, which is really, really uncomfortable. And it's so difficult with so many people losing their jobs for using the wrong terminology. And I'm really anti that, I think it has to be about people's commitment to rectifying the wrongs they've made.
Okay. And I think something that you've said just touches on another question I have, which links to expectations, which people have. So you just made a really good point that we need to build more bridges and leave room for the kind of mistakes to be made. But I want to touch more on what are the current expectations that media companies have right now when it comes to D&I, because I think also knowing those expectations gives us a bit of room to prepare ourselves if we possibly do make those mistakes, or even if we don't, when we are successful, how to keep on pushing and keep on trucking on. So I was listening to a podcast you participated in a few years ago talking about the current advertising space specifically, especially as your background was at MNC Saatchi. And at that point, you said that when it comes to the advertising space, inclusion isn't really great at that moment in time. Now, how would you describe the media, not just the advertising space, but also as an EDI professional kind of looking out, how would you describe inclusion in the media space? And then also, how would you describe expectations? How have expectations of the media sector when it comes to D&I, how have they evolved over the last few years?
Yeah, so I'll start with your last question, actually. So I think expectations have changed. I think those expectations have primarily been driven by consumers, and in particular, Gen Z. And, you can look at, any kind of research paper, white paper on behavior habits, what Gen Z want, and authenticity is definitely high up on there. Community and collective good, freedom of expression, learning. There's a wonderful report that the marketing agency Digital Fairies put together, and you can download it. It's definitely worth you checking out their website. And it just kind of lists all these priorities for Gen Z. Digital Fairy, just in case you didn't catch it. And so yeah, I think they are driving, particularly then that age group are driving the kind of changes that we're seeing, which is brilliant. Your first question, which was around, do I think things have moved on? I think there's a lot more effort and a lot more will than there once was. And I think, once again, that is being motivated by consumers. So, in the typical kind of like advertising, marketing world, I think, marketing agencies, advertising agencies are feeling the pressure from the brands that they work with, and those brands are feeling the pressure from the consumers. So it's kind of like a chain reaction.
Great.
So go on.
So I think just off of the back with the drive being consumers, I want to flip now the script of looking at D&I internally and seeing what the relationship is with that, and then what's then produced in content. My first question really is, do you think there is a relationship? Is there a relationship between the diversity of an organization, of a company, in relation to the content and representation they then portray in the content they produce?
Great question. I think there should be, but I think also there needs to be a consideration to, if you're in a part of the country where there isn't as much diversity, for instance, I think you should still have the right to create content that includes different types of people that sit outside of the dominant group that's within your agency. But the way in which you do that, you need to be conducting research, whether it be focus groups, whether it be bringing people in on a freelance basis. And, this is the great thing, obviously I'm speaking to you all from Greece. We live in a world now, even though governments globally have decided to really create very stark borders, we can push through those borders with digital technology. So there's no excuse whatsoever not to be working with people from different parts of the world, different communities that, see the world from a different lens. And that's what, EDI, this is what, equity, inclusion and diversity work is. It's about seeing the world through multiple lenses, so we can just create better products, better services.
Great. So other than some of the examples we've heard this morning, we heard from Channel 4 about the Paralympics, we heard about Black to Front, you've spoken about the organisation you're part of. Are there any other good examples of content that you're seeing that being produced which represents society as we kind of see and know it? And that's the different pillars as well. So not just race, not just disability, but mental health, sexuality, that you'd be happy to share with this wider group today.
Sure. Well, I can definitely talk to you from just thinking about, the programs that I watch on, BBC iPlayer, Netflix. And actually most of these examples will be by the lens of race. But obviously, Michaela Cole, just having that insight into, Ghanaian culture to a degree, or whether it be, sex education and having that insight into Nigerian culture and what it means to actually be someone that identifies as queer within that, I just think it's so brilliant. And, what I absolutely love, my heritage, my mum is of Jamaican ancestry, my dad is West Asian, Persian, Iranian. And, growing up, I'm 37, growing up, people didn't speak about their Africanness, but, we're now seeing people really just feel there's this sense of pride and there's a sense of visibility on television, in music. It's not just about Jamaican culture or Caribbean culture. It's, and I love it. I really, really love it so much. So I think those are probably two examples where I just think it's just been done so well with a lot of empathy. I don't actually know who the writer is for sex education, but whoever the writer is, they've done a phenomenal job in my view.
Great. So I'm gonna again flip the script just a little bit as we're still chatting and talk about maybe where there hasn't been such a great example, or more so I'll frame it from the position where there are lots of companies now, especially off the back of last year, who made a lot of statements that they were going to make changes, they were going to commit to implementing more D&I, both internally and also externally through the content that they produce. And I think there is a fear that often when it comes to being either a D&I professional or part of the CSR team, that conversation kind of stays in that group and it doesn't get transcended into the central part of the organization and really help facilitate maybe systematic change. Do you recognize this as something that's still apparently happening, do you think? And if that is the case, what ways would you suggest, or how would you advise professionals who kind of are in that bracket, kind of stuck in that silo of being the D&I professional, to kind of connect with the rest of the organization and facilitate that change?
So it's interesting because obviously I'm independent now. I've got a small consultancy, and I categorically will not take a project unless I've had a conversation with the most senior person in the organisation. And if I don't think they're on board, I will not take the job. There's just so many projects that I've said no to because I refuse for people to essentially leverage off all the work that I've done and it to be performative. But I think for people that are in-house, ultimately you have to get the most senior person on board. It's not about the work you do being mediated via HR, because sadly, speaking to some of the experiences that I've had some amazing experiences, but I've had some very negative experiences with HR. Sometimes HR can be the biggest blockers to progression within an organisation when it comes to EDI. And I've got a theory on that. I don't know if you want my theory just yet. Maybe I'll leave that for later, or maybe I'll just leave it altogether. But you need to, HR are integral to this process, because they essentially are going to be lifting a lot of the work, the policies that are going to be created. But, the CEO, the chairperson, they have to be on board. You need to have a direct reporting line to them, or at least a split reporting line if you are not of equal seniority to the HR director, for instance.
Great. So we know that there are great examples. You shared a few. We also know that there are some challenges. Let's look 10 years in the future now. Let's just do some horizon scanning. What do you think that content could ever get to a place where it is a great representation of the society that's receiving the content that it's produced? Do you think that could ever be possible? And if so, how do you think we could get there?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible. I've got some friends with disabilities, and it goes back to, I think my first point is about making sure that, we have different types of people in power. That power isn't just held by an archetype. If we are going to have, say, someone with a disability involved in a project, we need to make sure that we've done the groundwork to make sure that they feel welcomed in the organisation. So if someone's neurodiverse, one of my exes is autistic, and his worst nightmare is being in an open plan office, for instance. It just feels like an orchestra or a heavy metal concert that's going off in his head all the time. Have we carved out spaces within our open plan office area where people can actually work and can concentrate and are fit for people's neurodiversity? With remote working, we're seeing this massive push, sadly, for so many businesses just to want to go back to how things once were. And I just think it's so sad. Even if we look at class, so much is London centric in our country. It's or southern or southeast centric. If you're from a different part of the UK, you have to literally leave your community sometimes to find work. That, for me, is not on whatsoever. So how are we making an effort to make sure that we reach out to community so they don't have to leave the north or, leave their rural community in order to kind of, work in a media company? I think the saddest thing would be that we haven't learned anything from the past 18 months that we've all experienced collectively. I can't remember who said it, but, we've all been in the storm, but we've all been in different boats, and some people's experience of the last 18 months is very different to my experience or your experience or other people in the audience experience. But it's about us just being really empathetic and asking people what they actually need and what they want, and just having that open, two-way conversation. But I think, a lot of it sits in listening.
Great, that's a great point. And I think just from speaking with you and also having more conversations around D&I, it's an ongoing learning process. I think we're all learning what we know about ourselves and what we know about other cultures and contexts and backgrounds, and learning how to relay that with each other as well effectively, and also create working environments which could then translate into content which also represents that as well. Just to shift to a bit more of a personal question, just as an EDI professional, you shared a bit about your background and your heritage. What has inspired you to be brave in this space specifically and push past some of the discomforts that we've spoken about?
Do you know what? I really do just, so I believe a lot in inherited trauma. There's some wonderful theorists like Dr. Joy DeGuy, Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who is a Jewish American scholar. And I just think a lot of people are holding a lot of trauma, and it doesn't have to be racial trauma. It can be, you know, trauma from being bullied as a child. You know, there are so many toxic families where parents bully their children, or people are bullied by their siblings. And this work is just about being willing to acknowledge that some people have it really hard. A lot of people have it really hard. I really do believe that actually 99% of us are actually fighting something. We're actually in pain. We're carrying some form of trauma. And my job is to kind of meet people, to listen, to really understand where they're coming from, why they think, what they think. And, you know, to answer your question, why do I think this way and why do I do this work? I don't know, everything, it just all seems really obvious to me, but I know it doesn't seem obvious to other people, and I don't know why that is. But I have to say, I've been very fortunate to have been brought up in a very diverse family. You know, my dad's best friend is Arab. His wife is white German. You know, being from the Caribbean, we're an absolute melting pot. I've got Native American, I've got Jewish, I've got, you know, there's so much in me, and I don't know if it's that. It's my ancestors almost like pulling me, pushing me to do this work. I don't know.
Great, thank you. And I think your diverse background, that's obviously, like you already mentioned, played a core role in helping you, I think, explore this space and be brave. For people who may not have come from such a diverse background or work in a sector which isn't as diverse potentially like the media historically has been, but is trying to make strides in, how would you advise them to be more diverse? If that's, is there a structured way to become more diverse?
Yeah, I think so. Do you know what? Oh, I don't know if I froze. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Do you know what? I think it starts with being curious. Lost my words there. Curious. I think, you know, curiosity has, you know, the day we stop being curious, I think will be the saddest day for humanity. You know, curiosity is, you know, there's a positive side and there's a negative side. You know, the positive side is that it's created multiculturalism, but I suppose the negative side, it's also created colonialism, you know. But curiosity is so important. And there's a wonderful quote, I'm going to read it for you because I wrote it down. It's by the creative director, advertising giant, Bill Burnach, and he says, a principle isn't a principle until it costs you something. And, you know, this work, sadly, you'll have clients which will not be aligned with who you are, and then it's for you to choose whether you want to work with them. But I think it's about us also remembering that this is about the long game. It's not just about the short game, and the short game can be very, very painful to play, but it's just about actually, how am I going to future-proof my business? You know, the UK is going to look very different in 10, 15, 20 years' time, as will, for instance, parts of East Africa. We move around. That's just, we're all nomads, essentially. Nomadic people in our heart, deep down.
Yes, you make such a great point in that we move around, and because of that, I think content in itself will evolve with the movement of people. So the nature of these conferences is whether we mirror or move society. So looking at the mirror side of us mirroring society as media, it means we will kind of mirror what the world is shifting and replicating as well. And I think D&I is definitely an area and a topic which we will reflect and model what society looks like. But with that, I want to start by opening up the room to any questions for you, just based on our conversations, because I think we can go back and forth just talking about D&I generally, because there's so many different elements and parts to it. But I'll start by asking in the room, are there any questions? Oh.
Thanks, Sereena. I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one is, I believe it was KPMG who recently brought out a socioeconomic pay gap report. And I'm interested as to whether socioeconomics is coming into the work you're doing increasingly. I know there were some, I suppose, celebrations of that move, as well as some critique as to the methods of assessing socioeconomic background. And then my second question, you referred to working and I suppose the change in the nature of how we work a little bit. And I'm wondering when we look forward to future ways of working, and in particular the likes of hybrid working, what your sense is on how that will impact DE&I. And I think on one hand, we can see why flexible working would be beneficial, but I know there are also some fears that if some people are increasingly the only people present in the office, does that make them more likely to be, I suppose, eligible for progression, or the kind of recency or familiarity bias of seeing people and then them getting more opportunities for progression as a result?
Great questions. Thank you so much. Sorry, what's your name? I didn't catch it.
Sorry, I should have said that. Beth Rochford from Virgin Media O2.
Oh, hello, Beth. Thank you so much for your questions. Great questions. So for me, social and economic. So actually, I don't conflate socio-economic or social and economic. I always say social and economic, just because I think in the UK, that's just my preference, by the way. Most people don't do that, because I just think actually you can have social privilege, but not necessarily have economic privilege, and vice versa. So just to give you an example, you could have gone to a grammar school, but you could come from a low-income home. So for me, this has always been present in my work, but as you probably know, and I imagine that report that you just cited probably had within it, I'm assuming it had it within it, class isn't even a protected characteristic in the UK. So you can legally discriminate against someone based on their class. And obviously that is by design, in my view. I just want to say that, caveat that with my view. So yes, there has been somewhat of a desire to think about social and economic, but I have to say there's a lot of resistance. And interestingly enough, the resistance, in my view, or in my experience, and I've spoken to a few CEOs that are from working class backgrounds, the resistance tends to come from those who are from working class backgrounds and who have made it. That's been what I've seen, which is beyond problematic. But yeah, I really do hope there's going to be more conversation, obviously, with our current government's levelling up scheme, even though there hasn't been much of an elaboration on what that actually is. There seems like there is a bit more of a conversation. And actually, there are wonderful parties such as the Northern Independence Party, who were founded by Philip Proudfoot. I don't know if you've heard of them. And they founded, I think it was last year, they were founded. And Philip Proudfoot basically believes that actually we're not English, people that are from the North, the Northumbrian. And the reason for that is that they feel that there is a distinct culture, but also fundamentally, Westminster, the South East, or the South do not care about the North. So I think we're seeing, it's a really interesting moment in time for British history, I think. And obviously, if you were to also take into consideration, everything that's happening with, Scotland's National Party as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question there. And in regards to hybrid working, yeah, you're completely right. So many companies that are, presenteeism is so important. And if you're present, therefore you're doing work. And all of that needs to be rethought. And it's a shame. I feel like we haven't truly learned from the 18 months that we've had, and who knows, we might go into another lockdown. Maybe that will be a nice, refresher for business owners. But yes, there are definitely downsides to hybrid working as well. And I think the downsides definitely are, if you are someone that is junior in your career, you learn through observing. And you are therefore not privy to those, those meetings that perhaps you would be brought into at very last minute, So I think there's definitely a downside to being remote, and there's definitely a positive. But I think that everything is workable, and we can work around things if there's enough creativity and will.
I'm going to be cheeky and ask 2 questions as well, if that's okay. It's Sienna at Penguin Books. So I guess my first question is, how do you sort of square the circle between knowing that to truly kind of change a company or an industry will take time because it's rooted in culture and it's rooted in everyday practices, whether that be recruitment or promotion or whatever, rather than sort of necessarily sort of initiatives or projects, although they can help accelerate the pace of change. Like, how do you square the circle of that taking time, especially representation at senior level, for example, with the level of pressure that is coming on under organisations, especially from their own colleagues, which is, I think we certainly see, to say, you know, the time for change was yesterday type of thing. Like, you know, you can't just magic up a new CEO overnight. So how do you sort of navigate that? And then I guess my second question is also a kind of squaring the circle question, which is, how do you sort of, I guess, work the shift that businesses are changing off the back of this pressure versus the way that the government is currently behaving, where they are essentially weaponizing culture and making that a kind of electoral platform for themselves? Because that feels really at odds with actually the movement that is happening in business. And I'd love to hear your HR theory, either on or offline.
Great question. Sorry, what's your name as well?
Sienna.
Sienna, lovely to meet you. Sorry, you may have said it before, I didn't catch it. Yeah, great questions again. So I think patience is, you know, really is a virtue. I think it's just about being patient. And I think it's also about us not, if we were just to see it via a racialized lens, it's about us not comparing ourselves to America. You know, Black people have existed in America for a hell of a lot longer than they have in the UK on the scale. Obviously, we've had Black people in this country for centuries, but not on the scale that we have now. So I think it's about being patient. I think it's about us not comparing our, you know, representation stats to, say, American companies. I think it's about us understanding why. So it's about us being patient. It's about us really nurturing a pipeline. But I think it's also about us understanding why perhaps we don't have representation, the representation that we want. So is it because actually there are demands from families where actually you need to go into a career that's safer, such as medicine, engineering? And actually, when I was at MC Saatchi, I knew I had this theory. I was just like, I had this hypothesis. I was like, you know, there's definitely, there has to be some data around this. I know for sure through my experiences and friends' experiences that they were kind of, you know, pushed towards particular careers. And I was like, can we find this? So with our insights team, we did some research, and that's what we found. You know, if you're Black, Asian, minority, ethnic in the UK, just to locate it in the UK, you are 3 times more likely to feel the pressure to fulfill your parents' expectations. If you are Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, you are twice as likely to go into medicine or engineering. So these were stats that we found through all the research that we conducted. So yes, there isn't representation, but why isn't there representation? Is there not representation because it's not a viable career pathway for certain groups, communities? But in addition to that, is it not a viable, is there a lack of representation due to, do we attribute a particular type of value to different communities? And if so, we need to kind of unpick that and be self-reflective enough and be honest enough to say, actually, we attribute value to certain groups and don't attribute value to others. And your other question, I'm so sorry, I've forgotten what it is. Would you mind repeating it for me?
Just the sort of change between the way the government is going versus how businesses are going on this topic.
How could I forget? Yes. It's such a difficult one, you know, and sadly, I think this is feeding even more into this polarization that we are seeing, feeling, and I think the government are very much aware of that, hence why they're trying to pass a bill to prevent people from protesting. So there's a tension, and that tension's becoming even more heightened. And I think maybe once upon a time we looked to our governments to be our moral compass, but actually I think we're seeing a shift, and we now look to our consumers, we look to our people. We can hear our people in a much easier way than we previously could due to social media. So I don't know if I've actually answered your question, but I'm hopeful at least, but I'm also worried to see how much more of a division that's going to create, actually, the stark difference.
Mr. Simon?
Hi, Sereena. This is Simon from Carnstone. Can I invite you to go back to disability? You touched on it, but I'm always struck. I don't know whether you know, there's a report produced regularly called the Project Diamond Review, and it shows up the kind of representation gaps in British broadcast media. And year after year after year, disability is the biggest gap between the proportion of the society that actually is disabled and the number of disabled people we see on screen. And this always puzzles me. I can't work out why this is the one that seems to have such a huge gap, especially when you think that most of us are only one illness or one accident away from being disabled ourselves. We won't change our racial heritage, but this is a kind of almost a universal experience. Any thoughts on representation of disability?
Yeah, great question, Simon. Thank you. It's I think when it comes to disability, and I think this ties into eugenics actually, and I think this is kind of where we have to kind of look at the history. It's about creating a particular person that's perfect, or in a particular view of being perfect, that excludes different racial groups or ethnic groups, that excludes people that are differently abled. And I think with disability, I think as a world, we're yet to recognise the worth and value that people with disabilities offer to our society. And as you've obviously articulated, we essentially all are one step away from, having a disability. And actually, there's a lot of data that says that we grow into disability. So it's very much, part of many of our destinies. I've got a dear friend, and I don't know if this actually answers your question. I don't think it probably will, but I just wanted to share it with you anyway, the audience. A dear friend of mine has muscular dystrophy, and which means that he's a wheelchair user, and because his muscles are essentially wasting away, and he needs the wheelchair in order to keep his spine intact. Now, my friend has all the same sexual and romantic desires as most people, but because he has a disability, people assume that he shouldn't have those, or wouldn't have them and shouldn't have them. So there's a massive long way for us to go. And I have to say, I'm going to go back to sex education. I don't know if any of you have watched it. I'm quite addicted to it. But it was just so wonderful to see a wheelchair user in a romantic relationship with someone that was able-bodied. And we need to see more of that. And, that is I do believe in media as a way of really kind of pushing the dial within society. And I think that was a great example of media just doing that. So, why do we not place value on disability? I think you'll find its origins in eugenics.
I think we're bang on time in terms of the end of the session. But thank you so much, Sereena, for our conversation and for answering all those questions and for joining us virtually. And then we're just going to give you a short round of applause before we move on. But thank you again, Sereena.